In the state of North Carolina, before the autumn of 1913, the birth of a child was not written down. Not by the county, not by the state. A baby born in a cabin on a high ridge in 1908 entered the world with no line of ink to say so. If that same child wandered off into the laurel 2 years later and never came home, there was no death record either, because the state kept none of those before 1913 as well. A child could arrive and live and be lost and pass entirely out of the world without a single official page carrying the fact that they had ever existed. This is the story of the ones the ledger never held. A small headstone in a mountain cemetery, with no name cut into it. A blank space in a county register where a life should sit. 3 children, real and named and documented, who vanished from the southern mountains between 1792 and 1923, and the long, quiet arithmetic of everyone the record simply lost. The mountains did not swallow children the way the old stories say. There was no hunger in the ridges, but the country that held those children kept almost no account of them, and when they were gone, the silence that closed over the smaller ones was very nearly total. This is the old widow's ledger. The southern mountains at the turn of the 20th century were not a wilderness. They were farmed and settled and worked. Corn on the steep slopes, hogs turned loose in the woods, cattle driven up to summer range on the high balds. Families were large and land was thin. A single cove might hold 3 generations of the same name. Life in that country ran on kin and on church, and on the turning of the seasons. A cove was often a single extended family, and its in-laws, everyone related, everyone in and out of everyone else's cabin. The children raised half by their parents, and half by whichever aunt or grandmother was nearest when they scraped a knee. The church house on the branch was the center of the week, and the center of the year, the place where the marriages and the funerals and the baptisms happened, and where the community wrote itself down in the one book that was reliably kept, the church register, when it was kept at all. Work was constant and shared. The men cleared and plowed and hunted and drove the stock. The women kept the gardens and the kitchens and the looms and the sick, and the children were folded into all of it as soon as they could walk, hauling water, minding the younger ones, following along to the field and the barn and the high pasture. It was a hard life, and in most ways a good one, close and known. A world where a child was watched by a dozen pairs of eyes. But it was that same closeness, that same self-sufficiency, that kept the outside world at arm's length. A community that raised and married and buried its own had little occasion to write anything down for a government it rarely saw. And the government, for its part, could barely get in. But the country was closed. In the far northwest corner of North Carolina, 3 counties, Ashe, Allegheny, and Watauga, sat west of the Blue Ridge in the New River Basin, walled off from the rest of the state by mountains too high for easy roads. People there called them the Lost Provinces. They traded north into Virginia and west into Tennessee, because the ridge between them and their own state capital was a barrier no wagon crossed lightly. The first turnpike east was not started until 1911. The railroad did not reach Ashe County until 1914. A hard road out to Wilkesboro did not come until after 1921. That isolation is the first thing to understand, because isolation and record-keeping are the same subject. A government cannot count what it cannot reach, and through the years when these children were disappearing, the government of the Mountain South was barely reaching in at all. Consider what the paperwork actually looked like. In North Carolina, statewide registration of births and deaths did not begin until October of 1913, and even then it took years to take hold. Compliance did not become general until about 1920. Before that autumn, the only towns keeping birth records at all were Raleigh, which started in 1890, and Wilmington, which started in 1904. For the mountain counties, for the coves and the ridge farms, there was nothing. A child's arrival lived only in a family Bible, if the family kept one, and in the memory of a midwife. Tennessee is stranger still. The state began requiring birth and death records in 1908, which sounds early. But the law lapsed at the end of 1912, and for the whole of 1913, No one was charged with keeping those records at all. Archivists in Tennessee still call 1913 the dead year. Statewide record-keeping resumed in 1914, and even then general compliance was not reached until 1927. So a child born in the Tennessee mountains in 1913 has, in the eyes of the state, no official birthday. A child who died there that year left no certificate to say they had died, and behind both of those gaps sits a larger one. The federal census of 1890, the great decennial count that would have caught an entire generation of these mountain families by name, was destroyed. A fire in the Commerce Department building in January of 1921 ruined most of it, and what the flames left, the water and the neglect finished. For genealogists and historians, 1890 is a wall. The families who lived and died in the coves in that decade are, for the most part, simply gone from the national record. Put those three facts together. No birth records in North Carolina before 1913. A dead year in Tennessee. A burned census for 1890. And then imagine a child born into that gap, in a cove the roads had not yet reached, to a family who could not read or write. If that child vanished, there was no document to lose, because there had never been a document at all. The erasure was not a mystery. It was arithmetic. The scale of that blankness is easy to state and hard to feel, so it helps to follow one ordinary life through it, not a particular child, but the common case that repeated 10,000 times across the mountains south. A baby is born in a cove in the spring of 1910. No doctor attends. A midwife who cannot write comes over the ridge, and the birth is marked, if it is marked at all, by a line in the flyleaf of a family Bible, in a hand that spells the name however it sounds. The child grows. There is no school registration in many of these districts, or the school runs 3 months a year and keeps no roll that survives. The federal census taker comes by in 1910 and again in 1920, if the roads let him reach the cove at all, and those two visits, 10 years apart, are very nearly the only times in a childhood that the outside world writes the child's name down. Between them lies a decade in which the child is real to everyone who knows them and invisible to everyone who does not. Now let that child slip away in 1913, in the dead year, in a state that is keeping no death records. There is no certificate. The census of 1910 caught the child once, as a name and an age in a column, but the census of 1920 will simply not list them. And 100 years later, a researcher looking at those 2 pages will see a child appear, and then quietly not appear, with nothing to say whether they died or moved or were lost, or were never really there at all. That is what erasure looks like on paper, not a dramatic gap, a name that is present once and absent after, and no line anywhere to explain the difference. There is a stranger proof of all this, and it comes from the far end of these people's lives rather than the beginning. When the federal government created Social Security in the middle of the 1930s, and later when passports and pensions came to matter, mountain people who had been born before the record books existed suddenly needed to prove that they had been born at all, and they could not. There was no certificate to send for, because none had ever been made. So a whole apparatus grew up to handle it, the delayed birth certificate, a document filed years or decades after the fact, in which a grown man or woman went to the county courthouse and swore, with witnesses, that they had indeed been born on a certain day in a certain cove, and produced a family Bible, or an old neighbor, or a church record to back the claim. Grown adults, in other words, standing before a clerk to establish that they existed. The delayed certificates fill drawers in the archives of North Carolina and Tennessee, to this day, thousands of them, each one a small confession by the state that it had failed to write a person down the first time. Those are the ones who lived long enough to argue their own case. The children who did not live never got the chance. There was no one to file a delayed certificate for a 5-year-old who went into the Laurel in 1911 and did not come back, because a delayed certificate was a thing the living did for themselves. And behind every one of those adults who had to prove they had been born stand the siblings and the cousins who could not, because they were already gone, into ground that no register ever noted. That is the true meaning of the phrase, "the mountains swallowed them." It was never the ground that took the children, it was the silence. The disappearances themselves followed a small and terrible set of patterns, and they were almost always ordinary at the start. A child was sent down to the creek to fetch water and told to stay close. A child followed an older brother out to drive the cattle up to the summer bald and lagged behind on the trail. A child went out with a bucket to pick blackberries along a fence line at the edge of the woods. A child was left at the edge of a camp or a clearing, while the adults worked a field just out of sight. These were not careless families. This was the shape of every mountain childhood. The woods began where the yard ended, and the woods went on for a very long way. What made the mountains dangerous was not malice but geography. Fog could settle into a cove in minutes and turn a familiar hillside into a gray blank. The rhododendron and mountain laurel grew in thickets so dense the local people called them laurel hells. Tangles a grown man could lose himself in within a few yards. Ridge folded behind ridge, each one looking like the last. A small child who walked downhill, following the easy grade the way a lost person always does, could be a mile from home and 1,000 feet lower before anyone knew they were gone. The seasons of mountain work pulled children out into that country as a matter of course. In late spring, the families drove their cattle up to the high balds, the open grassy summits above the tree line where the stock grazed loose through the warm months, and children went along on those drives, walking behind the herd on trails that ran for miles up through the timber. In summer, the whole family worked the corn on slopes so steep the rows seemed to stand on end, and the smallest ones were set at the edge of the field, close enough to call to, far enough that a few steps into the trees put them out of sight. Berries came ripe along the fence lines and the burned-over clearings, and a child with a bucket could follow a line of blackberry canes deeper and deeper into the brush without ever deciding to go anywhere. Water came from the creek or the spring, always downhill from the cabin, always at the edge of the woods. Every one of those errands was ordinary. Every one of them put a small child at the exact seam where the cleared ground gave way to the mountain. And the mountain did not need to do anything dramatic to take a child who reached that seam and kept going. It only had to be large and steep and the same in every direction and patient. A child does not walk in a straight line. A lost child walks downhill and downstream and into cover, toward the easy footing and the shelter of the brush, which in that country meant away from the ridgetop trails where searchers would look, and down into the laurel, where they could pass within 20 feet and never see. Cold did the rest, or the creek did, or simply the distance. The mountains of the south are not the tallest in the country, but they are among the most tangled, and tangle is what hides a thing. And when a child did go missing, the response was the response of a community with no telephone and no sheriff's car. Word went out the only way it could, by voice and by foot and by horn. Neighbors left their own fields and came. Men strung out in lines along the ridges and combed the laurel by hand, calling the child's name until their voices gave out. Sometimes a hunting horn was blown from a high place so a lost child might walk toward the sound. These searches could run for days, and often they ran until the searchers simply could not continue, and then the child was left to the mountain. The men who searched knew the high country better than any outsider ever could, because they lived in it. Hunters who ran the ridges for bear and boar, stock drivers who took the cattle to the balds, timbermen who had cut over half the slopes. These were the searchers, and they brought real knowledge to the work. They knew where the laurel was thickest and where a body of water sat below a bluff and which drainages a walking child would naturally follow. But knowledge only stretched so far against the sheer size of the ground. A single cove could take a line of men a full day to walk, and there were always more coves. Rain came, as it did in the McKinley case, and washed out sign and drove the searchers off the high ground. Night came, and the search paused, and every hour that passed took the missing child further into country the searchers had already crossed. When the effort finally ended, it did not end with an answer. It ended with exhaustion, and with the slow understanding, spreading through a tired crowd of neighbors, that there was nothing more that hands and voices could do. What almost never happened was a written record. There were newspapers in the mountain south, small county weeklies, and now and then one of them printed a few lines about a lost child. But those papers were thin, and many issues did not survive, and a great number of the smallest disappearances never reached print at all. A tenant family in a distant cove, a child under school age, a search that turned up nothing. None of that was news the way a killing or a court case was news. The child was mourned by everyone who knew them and recorded by no one. Into that silence, much later, a different kind of story arrived. In recent decades, a genre of books and videos has gathered the old mountain disappearances into something the authors present as a single eerie phenomenon, hinting at forces in the wilderness that take people and leave no trace. The best known of these frameworks travels under the name Missing 411, and it has made the vanished children of Appalachia into a kind of folklore of the uncanny. The appeal of that genre is easy to understand. It takes a scattering of disconnected losses across a huge span of country and 100 years of time, and it draws a line through them, and a line feels like an explanation. A wilderness that deliberately takes children is frightening, but it is at least a single thing a person can hold in the mind, and it turns 100 separate griefs into one big mystery with the pleasing shape of a story. The trouble is that the line is drawn through the gaps in the record, not through the facts. When a genre selects only the cases where nothing was ever found, and sets aside the far larger number of children who were found, or who were plainly drowned or frozen or lost to ordinary causes, then of course the survivors of the selection all share the quality of leaving no trace. That is not a discovery about the wilderness. It is a description of how the cases were chosen. The pattern is real, but it is a pattern in the paperwork, a pattern of missing records and thin coverage and searches that could not cover the ground, and not a pattern in the mountains. That framing is not the subject here. Where the record is silent, the honest answer is that the record is silent, and silence is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of poor roads and thin newspapers and a state that did not yet write its people down. The cases that follow are told from documents, from historical markers, from a park ranger's files and a sister's memory, and a county's own admission of the gaps in its books. They are the ones we can actually name, and the fact that they can be named at all, out of so many who cannot, is the reason to tell them carefully. The first is a boy who died with a name, lost it for 60 years, and got it back. In March of 1915, in the high country above a settlement called the Sugarlands, in Sevier County, Tennessee, a boy climbed a mountain path alone. He had run away from his family. He was around 12 years old. He had no coat fit for the weather and no food, and the weather that came in was a spring snowstorm, the kind that arrives late and heavy in the high Smokies when the valleys below have already turned to mud and green. This was a quarter century before the land became a national park. The Sugarlands then was a scatter of hardscrabble farms along the west prong of the Little Pigeon River, families holding on to steep ground under tall timber. The boy went up into that country in the failing light with the snow already falling, and he did not come down. Somewhere on the mountain that night, alone and cold and far from any door, he died. The record does not say why he ran. That is the first silence in his story, and it should be left as a silence, because everything that might be offered to fill it would be a guess. A boy of 12 does not climb into a spring blizzard on a whim. Something drove him up that path with no coat and no food and no plan but away. Whatever it was went with him, and it is not written anywhere, and it is not for us to invent. What can be said is only what the mountain did with him. A late snow in the high Smokies is a heavy, wet, drowning kind of snow, and it fell all that night on a boy who had nowhere to be. By morning the storm had done its slow work, and the ridge held one more thing it would not give back on its own. Local hunters found him afterward and carried him down. A small figure, brought out of the high woods wrapped against the cold that had already done its work. And here the story turns from a death into something worse, because when they looked at the boy, no one knew who he was. He belonged to no family anyone could name. He had come from somewhere else, run to this mountain from a life the Sugarlands people knew nothing about, and the mountain had ended him before he could tell anyone his name. So the community did the only decent thing left to do. They gave him a Christian burial in a local cemetery, in a grave that could carry no name because no one had one to give. And there the boy stayed, under a stone that said nothing, on land that would one day become part of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A child, buried by strangers, unrecorded and unknown. For 60 years, that was the whole of his story. A cold night, a kind burial, and a blank where a name should be. The blank might have lasted forever. Nearly all of them did. But this one had a sister, and the sister did not forget. In May of 1975, a woman named Virgie Smith drove 45 miles from Knoxville, Tennessee, to the national park. She was an older woman by then, carrying something she had carried a very long time. She found a park ranger named Glenn Cardwell, and she asked him a question she had likely been turning over for decades. She wanted to know whether he had ever heard of a young boy who had died in the Smokies around 1915. She had a brother, she told him, who had been lost to those mountains long ago, and she needed, before the end of her own life, to find something of what had happened to him. 60 years is a long time to carry a question. Virgie Smith had been a girl herself when her brother went up the mountain and did not return, and she had grown up and grown old in a world that offered her no way to learn where he lay. There was no record to consult. There was no agency to petition. The boy had died before the state kept death records worth the name, on ground that had no rangers and no rules, and everything that might have marked his passing had happened by lamplight in a cove and stayed there. So the question had simply lived inside her, across all the decades and all the changes those decades brought, until she was an old woman driving a mountain road to ask it out loud to the one person she could think of who might, against every odd, know something. It was not a hopeful errand. It was the kind of thing a person does near the end, to lay down a weight before there is no more time to lay it down. Cardwell knew that 1915 was long before the park's own records began, but something in the question caught on a memory. He recalled a letter the park had received some time earlier, from a Gatlinburg woman named Lucinda Ogle. In it, Mrs. Ogle had passed along something her husband Ernest remembered from his boyhood, a story about a boy who had frozen to death in the mountains in the 1910s. The boy had been brought down to the Sugarlands by hunters. No one had known him, and so the people had buried him, a stranger's child, in a rural cemetery, and that was where the memory ended, with an unmarked grave and an unanswered question. It was the same boy. The sister's grief and the neighbor's memory and the ranger's files, laid side by side across 60 years, matched. The nameless grave in the Sugarlands held Virgie Smith's brother. His name was Ed McKinley. Think about what that recovery required. It required a sister to keep a lost brother alive in her memory for 6 decades. It required an old woman in Gatlinburg to think a childhood story worth writing down, and a park to keep the letter. It required a ranger with a long memory and the patience to connect a walk-in visitor's question to a piece of paper in a file. Nearly everything about it was chance, and it worked only because, at every step, someone had refused to let the boy stay nameless. That is the mercy in the McKinley story, and it is worth sitting with, because it is so rare. A name returned, a grave that finally meant something. A sister who got her answer before her own time ran out. For one child out of the countless the mountains took in those years, the silence was broken, and it was broken by love and memory doing the work the record never did. But the McKinley case is the exception that shows the rule. His name survived in one living memory, his sister's, and it survived nowhere else. If Virgie Smith had died a year before she made that drive, Ed McKinley would still be a blank stone today. The reason we can speak his name is not that the system recorded him. The system had already lost him completely. The reason is that a single grieving woman would not let go. Multiply the coves and the years and the lost children by all the sisters who died first, or who never learned where to ask, and the true scale of the erasure begins to come clear. The next child had the opposite fate. The record kept her name. It was the child it could not keep. To find her, the story has to leave the Blue Ridge and cross west, into a different range and a different state, because the pattern was never confined to Appalachia alone. It ran along the whole spine of the southern highlands. In the Ouachita Mountains of western Arkansas, in Scott County, in a district called White Oak Mountain, there lived a family named Turner, and on the 19th of October 1923, they lost their daughter. Her name was Pearl. She was 3 years old, born in the autumn of 1920. The Turners were mountain people in the same mold as the Sugarlands families, living close to the land in wooded, broken country, far from any town of size. On the day she vanished, the account holds that Pearl's parents, Lynn and Layla Turner, were away camping, and the little girl wandered off from the family's cabin and into the surrounding wilderness. One moment she was near the garden, the next she was gone into the trees, in a country where the trees ran unbroken for miles. What followed was not silence. It was one of the largest searches the region had ever seen. Hundreds of people came in from the nearby towns and combed the mountain for weeks. Pearl's disappearance did not stay a local matter either. It drew publicity across the country. Her name and her age carried in papers far from the Ouachita Hills. Strangers everywhere learning that a 3-year-old had walked into the Arkansas mountains and not come out. The difference between Pearl Turner's case and the countless coves that swallowed children in silence was, in the end, a difference of timing and attention. By 1923, the country had wire services and daily papers hungry for exactly this kind of story: a small child, and a vast wilderness, and a family's agony. And so Pearl's name traveled where the earlier names never could. That attention brought bodies to the mountain. Farmers and townsmen, and men who had never met the Turners walked White Oak Mountain in long lines, day after day, working the drainages and the thickets and the bluffs, calling a 3-year-old's name into country that gave nothing back. The search did not fail for lack of effort. It threw everything the era had at the problem, and the mountain absorbed all of it without a trace. A searched mountain that yields absolutely nothing has a way of turning a family's mind toward darker explanations. When weeks of hundreds of searchers cannot find so much as a shoe, some begin to wonder whether the child was ever there to find, whether the woods took her at all, or whether human hands did. In Pearl's case, some came to believe she had been carried off rather than lost. It is an understandable thought, and it may even be true. But it was never more than a thought. No suspect was ever named against evidence. No ransom came. No trace of a living child ever surfaced anywhere. The theory of abduction was born from the same emptiness that fed the theory of the wilderness, and neither could be proven, because there was nothing to prove either one with. That is the particular cruelty of a case like this. It does not just take the child, it takes even the knowledge of how the child was taken. And for all of it, the hundreds of searchers and the weeks of effort, and the national attention, they found nothing, not the child. Not a shoe, not a scrap of a dress, not a single sign of which way she had gone. Some came to believe she had been taken, carried off by someone, rather than lost to the woods, because a searched mountain that yields nothing at all can feel less like an accident than a theft. But belief is not evidence, and no evidence ever came. Pearl Turner was never found. More than a century later, her fate is still unknown. Set her beside Ed McKinley, and the two cases become a matched pair, each holding what the other lacked. The Sugarlands took a boy and kept his body, then lost his name for 60 years until a sister brought it back. The Ouachitas kept a girl's name, printed it in papers from coast to coast, and lost the child so completely that not one trace of her has ever surfaced. In the mountains of the South, in those years, a family could lose a child to the record's silence, or to the mountain's silence, and it was never certain which mercy was the smaller one. Pearl Turner's disappearance sits near the late edge of our window, in 1923, when the roads and the record books had finally started to arrive. To find the deepest root of the pattern, the oldest documented case, the story has to go back much further, more than a century before Pearl, to the very beginning of settlement in the Blue Ridge. And it has to go back to the one child, out of all of them, whose family finally got an answer. Her name was Catty Sage. In 1792, she lived with her parents, James and Lovis Sage, on Elk Creek in Grayson County, in the far southwest corner of Virginia, high Blue Ridge country, as remote in that year as any place in the eastern mountains. Catty was 5 years old, a small girl described in the family's long memory as fair-haired. On a summer day, the story goes, her mother took her down to the creek to fetch water and told her to stay near. And Catty, being 5, saw butterflies over the water and went after them the way any small child would. Her mother turned, and Catty was gone. The family searched. Neighbors searched. The wilderness gave back nothing, and in time the searching had to stop, and the Sages were left with the same emptiness every one of these families was left with. A child who had been there in the morning and was nowhere by night, and no way in the world to know what had become of her. For decades, that was all they had. Rumor and heartbreak and an unanswered question passed down through the family like an heirloom no one wanted. But Catty Sage had not died in the woods. She had been abducted, taken by human hands. The account preserved by the Grayson County Historical Society and marked today by a Virginia State Historical Marker holds that a man carried the girl off and that she passed from his hands to a Cherokee camp, and from there, north and west, by a long and brutal journey into Ohio, where she was adopted by the Wyandot people and given the name Uroquanes. She grew up among them with no memory of the creek or the butterflies or the mother who had turned around too late. The trauma of the taking, by the family's account, had erased her early childhood entirely, so that the girl from Elk Creek was gone even from the mind of the woman she became. She married into the tribe. She lived a full Wyandot life across the whole sweep of the early 19th century, and she lived it through the hardest years the Wyandot endured, the steady pressure of a government and a stream of settlers who wanted the land, the treaties that took it piece by piece, and at last the removal itself. In 1843, her people were driven out of Ohio altogether and carried west, by wagon and by steamboat, to a reservation in Kansas. She went with them, an old woman by then in the reckoning of that era, still bearing a name and a life that had nothing to do with the creek bank where she had begun. Back in Virginia, the other half of the story was playing out in the way all these stories played out, in silence. Her parents, James and Lovis Sage, lived on at Elk Creek with a daughter who had simply ceased to exist one summer afternoon, and no earthly means of learning what had become of her. They would have died without an answer, as every one of these mountain parents died without an answer, if the matter had rested with them. It did not rest with them. It rested, as the McKinley case would rest a century later, on a sibling who outlived the parents and would not let the question die. And then, 56 years after a 5-year-old chased butterflies away from her mother, the impossible happened. In 1848, Catty's brother Charles was at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, when a Wyandot man remarked that Charles closely resembled a white woman who lived among the tribe. The thread was pulled. Charles went to see her and saw the family in her face. His brother Samuel came and confirmed it. Through an interpreter, the woman told them her own story, that she had been stolen as a child by a white man, long ago, from a place she could no longer remember. She was Catty Sage. She had been found. Sit with the sheer improbability of that moment. 2 brothers stand in Kansas before an aging Wyandot woman who speaks no English, who has no memory of Virginia, who has lived her entire adult life as another people's daughter and wife, and elder, under another name. And across the ruin of 56 years and 2,000 miles, they recognize their own blood in her face. Everything about it had to line up. The girl had to survive the taking and the journey, and a lifetime of hardship and removal. A brother had to travel to the one fort where a Wyandot man knew them both. That man had to think a passing resemblance worth mentioning. And a family memory of a lost daughter had to still be alive enough, 2 generations on, for the brothers to know what they were looking at. Change any one of those things, and the woman in Kansas dies Uruquanes, and nothing more, and the sages of Elk Creek go to their graves never knowing. It is the rarest thing in this entire account, a disappearance that closed, and it closed only because a chain of near impossibilities held from one end to the other. She did not come home. She was past 60 by then, and her whole life was Wyandotte, and she chose to stay with the family and the people she had. She died a few years later, in 1853, but her brothers went back to Virginia knowing, finally, what had become of the little girl at the creek. After 56 years, the sages had their answer. It is the only answer in this entire account, and it is worth being honest about what kind of answer it was. It came more than half a century late. It came only because Caddy had been taken by people rather than lost to the woods, so that she survived to be recognized. It came by pure chance, a passing remark at an army fort 1,000 miles away, and it still did not give the family their child back, only the knowledge of where she had gone. That was the best outcome any of these mountain families ever received. A truth, arriving 2 generations late, about a child who by then was already old. For every Caddy sage whose thread was somehow pulled, there were the others, the ones with no abduction to survive, and no army fort, and no passing stranger, with a good eye for a family face. There were the ones the woods actually took, and there were the smallest ones of all, the babies and toddlers born into the record's blank years, who left no birth line, and no death line, and no newspaper column, and whose disappearance was known only to the people who loved them and died with those people when they died. That is where the ledger runs out. 3 names can be set down here with confidence: Ed McKinley, Pearl Turner, Caddy Sage, because in each case something survived that the ordinary silence did not touch. A ranger's file, a national headline, a state historical marker, and a family's stubborn memory. The rest cannot be named, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. The historical record does not describe what happened to most of the children the Southern Mountains lost between the Revolution and the coming of the roads. In many cases, the record does not even establish that a particular child existed, because the paper that would have said so was never made, or was burned in 1921, or lapsed in the dead year, or was never required in the coves at all. Walk the old cemeteries in those mountains today, and the evidence is still there, in plain sight, for anyone willing to read it. Small stones, child-sized, set apart at the edges of family plots. Field stones with no carving at all, just a rock stood on end to mark that someone lies beneath. Markers with a first name and no last, or a last name and no dates, or 2 dates close enough together to tell a whole short life in a glance. Some of those graves belonged to children who were known and grieved and simply never written into any book beyond the churchyard, and a few of them, like the one in the Sugarlands, belonged to children who were not even known, buried by neighbors who did the decent thing for a stranger's child and could give the stone no name. There is a hard symmetry in all of this. The same counties that would one day fill drawers with delayed birth certificates, documents in which grown mountain people swore before a clerk that they had been born, held cemeteries full of children who never got to swear anything, whose births had gone equally unrecorded, and whose deaths closed the account before anyone thought to open it. The adults proved their existence because they lived to need to. The children could not, and so for most of them the churchyard stone is the only record that was ever made. The birth certificate, and the death certificate, and the census line all at once, a single rock standing in for an entire absent paperwork. And it is worth remembering how thin the thread was for even the 3 who came back to us. Ed McKinley's name survived in exactly 1 living memory and would have died with his sister. Pearl Turner's name survived because a wire service happened to find her story worth carrying in 1923, when 1,000 quieter disappearances in quieter years were carried nowhere. Caddy Sage's name came back only because a stranger at a distant fort happened to notice a family resemblance in a woman's face. Take away the sister, the wire, the stranger, and all 3 of them slide back into the same silence that holds the rest. That is how narrow the difference is between a child we can name and a child we cannot. Not the size of the tragedy, only the accident of whether one fragile thread happened to hold. The mountains did not swallow these children. That is the folklore, and it is a comfort of a kind, because a mountain that takes children is at least a reason. The truth is quieter and harder. The children were lost, the way children have always been lost, to weather and distance and the woods that began where the yard ended. And then they were lost a second time, more completely, to a country that had not yet learned, or bothered, to write its own people down. The first loss was a tragedy. The second was a system. 3 of them got their names back onto the page. One by a sister who drove 45 miles with a question she had carried for 60 years. One by a nation that printed her name even as it failed to find her. One by a chance remark at a fort in Kansas, 56 years too late. The rest are still where the silence left them, under the nameless stones, in the blank spaces of registers that were never kept, in the memory of no one now living. They were here. The ledger should have said so.